Imagine spending years believing that one place on earth represents the closest possible connection to Jehovah's organization. You hear stories about it from the platform. You see smiling volunteers in carefully produced videos. You are told that serving there is not merely a job, but a sacred privilege. So you simplify your life, leave your family and congregation behind, and walk through the doors of Bethel, convinced that your faith is about to become stronger than ever. But then something unexpected happens. The closer you get to the center of the organization, the more questions begin to appear. You see how decisions are made. You discover that spiritual language and institutional necessity are not always the same thing. You meet men you once imagined as distant spiritual giants and realize that they are also administrators, capable of preferences, disagreements, misjudgments, and ordinary human limitations. And one day, after entering Bethel full of certainty, you leave headquarters carrying doubts you never had before. Why does this happen to some Bethelites? Why can the place called the House of God become the place where an idealized image begins to break apart? And why do some former Bethelites remain loyal witnesses, while others eventually question everything they were taught? Stay until the end, because the deepest reason may not be that Bethel gives people new information. It may be that Bethel removes the distance that once made complete certainty possible. And as you listen, ask yourself one question. If seeing the inner workings of a religious organization weakens someone's faith, was that faith resting on God or on an image of the organization? If you value respectful investigations into the history and inner workings of Jehovah's Witnesses, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps these carefully researched discussions reach more people. And if you have served at Bethel or personally know someone who has, share only what you are comfortable sharing in the comments. Did the experience strengthen faith, create questions, or somehow do both? Point 1. The Bethel. They imagined. To understand the doubts, we first have to understand the expectation. For a young Jehovah's Witness, Bethel is rarely presented as just one possible form of volunteer service. It often represents the spiritual center of the visible organization. The name itself means House of God. Official descriptions explain that Bethelites live, worship, and work together, supporting the worldwide preaching activity. They receive room, board, and an allowance for personal expenses, rather than a conventional salary. Every assignment, from offices and writing departments to kitchens, housekeeping, maintenance, laundries, and printing operations, is described as contributing to sacred service. In congregations, a Bethel invitation can feel like spiritual confirmation. The person has probably spent years demonstrating reliability, and family members may speak proudly about the invitation. Younger witnesses may view the new Bethelite as an example to imitate. That expectation matters because disappointment is measured against what a person expected to find. If someone enters an ordinary workplace and discovers office politics, personality conflicts, or inefficient decisions, it may be frustrating, but it is hardly a spiritual crisis. An ordinary company never claimed to be the earthly center of divine direction, but there is a hidden danger in an ideal that high, ordinary reality has nowhere to go. Every contradiction becomes spiritually significant. A harsh overseer is no longer simply a difficult manager. Favoritism is no longer ordinary workplace unfairness. A decision that appears financially motivated is no longer just administration. Everything happens inside the House of God. So everything can force the Bethelite to search for a spiritual explanation. The first doubts may begin with something surprisingly small. Why was one brother promoted while another qualified brother was overlooked? Why does an assignment described as a privilege sometimes feel like a test of compliance? Why are some concerns heard while others are treated as signs of a poor attitude? None of these questions alone destroys faith, but they create the first gap between Bethel as imagined and Bethel as experienced. Here is the first question for the comments. Is it fair to prepare young people for Bethel by emphasizing the privilege without speaking just as openly about the institutional pressures? Or would complete honesty weaken the desire to volunteer? Point 2. When spiritual devotion begins to feel like performance, the second source of doubt is not usually one dramatic revelation. It is accumulation. Bethel life brings work, worship, housing, meals, friendships, and religious identity into the same environment. That unity can be inspiring, but it can also make it difficult to separate personal conscience from institutional expectations. In an ordinary job, criticism of your performance concerns your work. At Bethel, where the assignment is understood as sacred service, Criticism can feel like a judgment on your spirituality. Official Watchtower material has acknowledged that new Bethelites may initially feel lonely and miss family and friends. It also notes that, although the normal schedule allows time for meetings and field service, Bethelites may sometimes receive extra duties. That sounds reasonable. Every large volunteer operation has demanding periods. But the psychological question is what happens when a person feels exhausted, discouraged, or troubled and has no neutral space in which to process it. The same community provides the person's assignment, home, social circle, spiritual instruction, and reputation. If a Bethelite complains about work, will it be interpreted as ingratitude? If he questions a decision, will someone wonder whether he is humble? Over time, spirituality can begin to feel measurable through performance. Who accepts inconvenient assignments without hesitation? Who appears enthusiastic? Who gains greater responsibility? Official material states that there are no social distinctions based on assignment. Yet former Bethelites sometimes describe a more complicated social reality, in which departments, connections, and reputation affect how a person is perceived. That does not prove that every promotion is unfair. Large organizations need structure, but Bethel is judged by the spiritual claims surrounding it. The stronger the claim of divine guidance, the more unsettling ordinary organizational behavior becomes. And this is where cognitive dissonance begins. The Bethelite has two possible explanations. The first is that the organization is operating under Jehovah's direction, so the discomfort must reveal a defect in the individual, perhaps pride, weakness, impatience, or insufficient spirituality. The second is that the organization may sometimes behave exactly like other human institutions. For a loyal witness, the first explanation is far safer. So instead of questioning the system, the person questions himself. But doubts pushed inward do not disappear. One inconsistency joins another until a private concern becomes a pattern. When the Bethelite finally speaks, the response can matter more than the original problem. A sincere answer may restore confidence. A formulaic answer, pray more, wait on Jehovah, trust the brothers, may convince the person that the institution has no answer at all. What do you think? When someone raises a sincere concern, is telling that person to wait on Jehovah an expression of faith, or can it sometimes become a way of protecting leaders from accountability? Point 3. The closer they get, the more human the authority becomes. The third point takes us beyond demanding schedules and personality conflicts. Some Bethelites gain proximity to correspondence, writing, translation, legal matters, service departments, or administrative decisions. They do not necessarily discover one enormous hidden secret. What they may discover is more destabilizing. Teachings and policies presented to the congregations with certainty can emerge from a recognizably human process. Ordinary publishers encounter the final product, the finished article, approved announcement, prepared video, or official explanation. The discussion that preceded it remains invisible. They do not see which arguments were rejected, how wording changed, or whether respected brothers disagreed. A Bethelite closer to that process may see uncertainty before it becomes certainty on the printed page. A policy may be revised after years of being defended. Change itself is not evidence of dishonesty. Responsible organizations correct mistakes. The difficult question is whether members may identify a mistake before headquarters officially acknowledges it. If questioning an old teaching is disloyal on Monday but accepting a revised teaching is faithful on Tuesday, where exactly is loyalty being placed? In truth or in timing? The most famous historical example is Raymond Franz. He served at the world headquarters for 15 years and spent 9 of those years on the governing body. Whatever one thinks of the conclusions he later published, his position gave him unusually direct exposure to high-level decision-making. He described reaching a personal crossroads after watching institutional authority operate from the inside. His case should not be used to claim that every Bethelite follows the same path. It demonstrates something narrower but important. Even proximity to the governing body did not automatically eliminate doubt. For at least one governing body member, proximity intensified it. That challenges a common assumption that doubts exist because someone lacks information or contact with responsible brothers. What if some doubts arise from having more information? What if the problem is not distance from headquarters, but the disappearance of distance? The organization acknowledges human imperfection, yet how much imperfection can affect a decision before members may examine it critically? Can it explain a failed prediction, a reversed interpretation, or years of confident teaching later called an adjustment in understanding? If it can, why should current teaching be protected from respectful examination? Once a Bethelite has seen the process, simple phrases may no longer work. The brothers have more information is less persuasive when you have worked near the brothers. Claims that the organization cannot go in a wrong direction become harder to define when direction has demonstrably changed. So consider this carefully. Should greater access to religious leadership create stronger confidence because the process is transparent? If greater access instead creates greater doubt, what does that suggest about the distance maintained between leaders and ordinary members? Point 4. Leaving Bethel can remove more than an assignment. The fourth point explains why the deepest questions may appear after a Bethelite leaves. For years, the Bethelite's entire life may have been organized around one identity. The assignment answered the question, "What am I doing with my life?" The Bethel family provided friends, routine, housing, recognition, and purpose. Even exhausting work carried sacred meaning. Leaving, therefore, does not feel like changing jobs. It can feel like losing a spiritual location in the world. Sometimes departure is voluntary. At other times, restructuring reduces the workforce. The organization's 2017 yearbook explained that Bethel routines and services were being reduced or eliminated, and that fewer members would be required. Those reassigned were presented as continuing their service in the field. From the individual's perspective, reassignment can be disorienting. Bethelites are unsalaried and may have spent years developing specialized organizational experience rather than a conventional career. Their housing, routine, and community were connected to the assignment. When it ends, employment and housing concerns arrive beside the emotional question of why a privilege once treated as precious is no longer needed. Many transition successfully and remain committed witnesses. There is no universal story, but others reconsider experiences they previously suppressed. Inside Bethel, every difficulty could be endured as part of a sacred assignment. Outside, the person finally has enough distance to ask whether the explanation made sense. This is also when a painful contrast can appear. Members may have praised the person when he entered Bethel and presented his life as evidence of Jehovah's blessing. If he later expresses doubts, his years of insider experience may no longer increase his credibility. Was he trusted because of his character or because he supported the approved narrative? Research into former Jehovah's Witnesses has found that leaving can affect identity and belonging. A 2024 inquiry into 6 former Bethelites identified a recurring sequence in their accounts: an initial doubt, a triggering event, an unsuccessful attempt to resolve it, and a turning point. 6 cases cannot represent everyone, but the pattern suggests that some first tried to preserve belief and found that their questions could not be resolved within permitted boundaries. If former Bethelites are wrong, their claims should be answerable with evidence. But if members are warned not to hear them at all, the warning creates its own question. Why should truth require protection from first-hand testimony? So why do some Bethelites leave headquarters with more doubts than faith? It may begin with an expectation no human institution can fulfill. They arrive expecting the house of God and encounter a community containing sincere sacrifice, meaningful work, friendship, and devotion, but also hierarchy, pressure, conflicting personalities, institutional priorities, and ordinary human judgment. Those who move closer to decision-making may then discover that certainty at the congregation level can be the final presentation of a far more human process at headquarters. Policies are discussed. Language is chosen. Interpretations change. Leaders disagree. Practical concerns matter. None of that proves that every decision is wrong. But it can destroy the assumption that organizational direction and God's voice are always indistinguishable. Perhaps then, Bethel does not always create doubt. Perhaps it exposes the difference between faith in God and faith in an institutional image. If those two forms of faith have been fused together, discovering flaws in the institution can feel like losing God. But they are not necessarily the same loss. This is the deeper issue. A faith that depends on leaders appearing more certain or spiritually exceptional than they are will always be fragile. It requires the finished publication instead of the discussion behind it, and institutional success to be called divine blessing, while failure is called human imperfection, without asking who decides which explanation applies. But genuine truth should not become weaker when examined closely. Honest questions should refine confidence, not threaten it. First-hand experience should add clarity, not become testimony that members are afraid to hear. Some former Bethelites lose confidence in the organization, but retain faith in Jehovah. Some reconstruct their Christianity elsewhere. Others abandon religious belief or remain witnesses with unspoken questions. Their conclusions differ, and it would be dishonest to force them into one story. But all of them leave us with a question worth confronting. If someone can spend years at the center, work beside respected leaders, observe the process closely, and emerge less certain than before, should we dismiss that person as spiritually weak, or should we ask what he saw? Now I want to hear your perspective. If you served at Bethel, did proximity strengthen your confidence or complicate it? If you have never served there, do you believe seeing headquarters from the inside would strengthen your faith? And most importantly, do you believe loyalty to Jehovah and loyalty to an organization must always mean the same thing? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. Personal experiences are especially valuable, but please avoid identifying anyone who has not chosen to speak publicly. If this investigation gave you something meaningful to consider, like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes sincere questions deserve sincere answers.